the most powerful woman on Wall Street, could not save her own child. For 18 months, Margaret Hale poured $8 million into that penthouse 30 specialists from Harvard Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins. They came with credentials and the quiet confidence of men who had never been wrong. One by one, they left. And 9-year-old Lily kept fading, not like a light switched off, but like a photograph, left too long in the sun, slowly, irreversibly, while her mother's empire kept growing in the room next door. Then came a Tuesday no one saw coming. A dented delivery truck in the basement. A man in scuffed boots, hauling boxes of groceries up to the 38th floor. No degree. No white coat. No reason to stay. But he stopped. He looked at something every expert had touched, cataloged, and walked right past. What he saw didn't just save a little girl. It exposed everything the system had quietly agreed to ignore. Daniel Cruz woke up at 5 every morning, not because an alarm told him to, but because silence did. The apartment on Clover Street in Brooklyn had a particular quality of quiet at that hour, not peaceful, just empty. The kind of empty that had a shape that took up space on the other side of the bed and at the second chair at the kitchen table. 3 years since Claire died, and the silence still had her outline. He made coffee. He packed Mason's lunch. He checked that his son's sneakers were by the door and his backpack was zipped. These were the small rituals that held the morning together, the handholds he reached for before the day got too wide to cross. Mason was 7 with his mother's crooked smile and his father's relentless habit of asking why. Why is the sky darker on one side before sunrise? Why do leaves fall before it snows? Why do some people get sick and nobody figures it out in time? That last one wasn't Mason's question. That one was Daniel's, the one he had been carrying since Claire's funeral, turning it over and over in his hands, like a stone he couldn't put down. She had been 33 when she died. Colon cancer caught 2 years too late, after 2 years of being told it was stress, then IBS, then something hormonal. 2 years of the wrong answers from the right doctors. By the time someone ordered the correct test no longer mattered. Daniel didn't fall apart after she died. He didn't drink. He didn't disappear. He read. Every night after Mason went to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and whatever journal article or clinical report or toxicology paper he could find online. He wasn't trying to become a doctor. He knew that wasn't possible. Knew it in the same bone-deep way he knew he couldn't go back and change what happened. He was trying to understand where the system had failed her, the exact seam, the precise moment when something should have been caught and wasn't. He needed to know what question nobody had thought to ask. One night he hadn't heard Mason get up. The boy had padded out in his socks, found his father bent over a dense PDF about enzyme deficiencies and gastrointestinal misdiagnosis, and stood there for a moment before asking the question quietly, "Dad, what are you reading all this stuff for?" Daniel looked up. In the low kitchen light, Mason's hair was flattened on one side from his pillow, and his eyes were half closed. And he looked so much like Claire in that moment that Daniel had to breathe through it before he could answer. "To understand why Mom got sick," he said, "and so that if someone ever needed me, I'd know where to look." Mason considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to something he doesn't fully understand, but decides to trust. Then he climbed into his father's lap, tucked his head against Daniel's chest, and fell asleep on top of the research papers. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He sat in the kitchen light with his son's weight against him and kept reading, turning pages carefully so as not to wake him. Across the East River and 38 floors, up the most expensive silence in Manhattan, belonged to Margaret Hale. Her penthouse occupied the top floor of a glass tower that caught the morning light like a blade. Inside, the design was all clean angles and restraint, pale oak brushed steel, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down over Central Park like a verdict. Every object in that apartment had been chosen to project one thing: control. Margaret had built her life on that principle. She had started Hale Capital at 31 with a rented desk and a borrowed reputation, and had spent the next 13 years turning it into one of the most formidable investment firms in New York. Her marriage had not survived the pace of it. She and Lily's father had separated when Lily was 4, quietly and without public spectacle, which was the only way Margaret knew how to do anything. She was not someone who lost. She was not someone who waited. She was the woman other executives studied from across conference tables, trying to figure out what she knew that they didn't. What they never saw was the 45 minutes she spent every night in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching Lily sleep, checking that her chest still rose and fell. Lily had been a different kind of child, the sort who memorized star charts before she finished 3rd grade, who kept a sketchbook of constellations under her pillow, who would argue passionately and at length about why Orion was more beautiful than Ursa Major. She had her mother's precision and something warmer underneath it, something that didn't come from Margaret at all, and that Margaret had quietly loved most about her. Then one morning about 18 months ago, Lily had woken up tired. Not the ordinary tired of a child who stayed up past her bedtime. This was heavier. It sat on her differently. Margaret had noticed and had called a doctor by 10 that morning because that was who she was. Someone who responded immediately and with resources. The doctor found nothing serious. Another doctor found something slightly different. A third found something else entirely. The tiredness became joint pain. The joint pain became tremors in Lily's hands. Small ones at first, barely visible, the kind you could almost convince yourself you hadn't seen. Then came the episodes, brief frightening lapses, where Lily seemed to leave the room without going anywhere. Then the cognitive fog settled in like weather, and Lily began losing words mid-sentence, reaching for them and finding nothing. By month 6, a hospital bed had been installed in the penthouse living room. Margaret had not wanted it. There had in fact spent 20 minutes arguing with the medical coordinator about alternatives, but in the end, practicality won. It always did with her. The bed sat at the center of the room, like a rebuke, surrounded by pale Nordic furniture and city light, the one thing in that apartment that Margaret had not chosen and could not make fit. Specialists came through over the next 12 months, Harvard neurologists, Mayo Clinic immunologists. Among them, a toxicology team, led by a Dr. Warren Elias, who arrived with 2 colleagues and a thorough methodology and left with 6 pages of inconclusive findings. A rare disease team from Johns Hopkins. Each one offered a diagnosis with enough confidence to generate hope, and each diagnosis eventually collapsed under the weight of Lily not getting better. Margaret responded the only way she knew how. She increased the budget. She expanded the search. She tightened every protocol around Lily's care until the penthouse ran like a medical facility, temperature-controlled schedule. Controlled, visitor-controlled. If she could not cure her daughter with certainty, she could at least eliminate every variable she could see. What she could not eliminate was what happened at month 14. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The 26th specialist had left earlier that evening with a new hypothesis that everyone in the room had already intuited would not lead anywhere. Margaret had seen it on Sandra's face, on the night nurse's face, on the face of the specialist himself, as he shook her hand at the door, that particular combination of professional composure and private resignation. She waited until the apartment was quiet, then went to sit with Lily. Her daughter's eyes opened. They moved to Margaret's face, and then something in them didn't land. They passed over her, the way they might pass over a stranger. Lily's voice, when it came, was small and confused. "Who are you?" Margaret did not answer. There was nothing to say that the moment could hold. She reached out and covered Lily's small hand with her own, and she sat there until her daughter's eyes closed again and her breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did Margaret allow her shoulders to drop. She bent forward, her forehead nearly touching the edge of the mattress, and her body shook once-twice without making any sound at all. Sandra was standing just outside the door. She turned away and did not look back. The next morning, Margaret walked into her board meeting at 8 o'clock, sharp, her posture exact, her expression giving nothing. She had not slept. No one at that table would ever know that. But from that night forward, she gave one quiet instruction to Sandra that she never repeated and never explained. No one, not the doctors, not the nurses, no one was permitted to remain in Lily's room after 10 o'clock at night, except her. By month 18, the rhythm of the penthouse had worn itself into something close to routine, which was its own particular kind of grief. Sandra managed everything: the schedules, the suppliers, the rotating medical staff, the daily documentation that now ran to dozens of pages a week. She had worked for Margaret for 9 years, and she understood without being told that the most useful thing she could do was to keep every operational detail so well ordered that Margaret never had to think about it. That was how Margaret survived, by not having to think about the things she couldn't fix. The 28th specialist had recommended a strict nutritional protocol. Sandra placed the order with a small organic food supplier out of Brooklyn, a company whose sourcing documentation was meticulous enough to satisfy the specialist's requirements. The order was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. That Tuesday, the delivery was assigned to Daniel Cruz. He pulled the company van into the basement garage of the tower at 3:30, checked the delivery slip, and loaded the boxes onto a hand truck. He had done this route before high-rises, along the Upper West Side doorman and service elevators, and the particular efficiency of buildings that treated delivery workers as a logistical function rather than a human encounter. He was used to it. He didn't mind it. Sandra met him at the service entrance on the basement-level clipboard, in hand, already moving through the checklist before he had fully stopped the hand truck. She had just finished signing when her radio crackled. The voice on the other end was the night nurse calling from upstairs. Calm, but clipped the way medical professionals train themselves to sound when something is happening that requires speed without panic. Lily was having an episode. Mrs. Hale was asking for Sandra immediately. Sandra looked at Daniel. She looked at the boxes. She looked at the radio in her hand. She pulled a key card from her lanyard and held it out. 38th floor, she said. Leave everything in front of the kitchen. Thank you. Then she was gone, moving fast toward the staff elevator without looking back. Daniel stood in the basement corridor with the key card in his palm. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. Somewhere in the building's pipes, something moved and settled. He had no reason to be curious. He was a delivery driver. He had a hand truck full of groceries and a card that would take him to a floor, and his job was to put the boxes down and leave. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He wheeled the hand truck inside, held the key card to the reader, and pressed 38. The elevator rose in silence. When the doors opened, the apartment was exactly what he hadn't expected. Vast and still and full of afternoon light. The city spread out below the windows like a map of everything money could buy. It took him only a moment to locate the kitchen. It took him slightly longer to register the hospital bed in the middle of the living room. He set the boxes down. He straightened up. And then he saw the girl. She was lying on her back, her face turned toward the ceiling, her eyes open and tracking something that wasn't there. She was small, younger than Mason by a year or two, he guessed, and she had the particular stillness of a child who had stopped expecting the world to be interesting. Daniel stood at the edge of the kitchen. He should leave. He knew that. He had the delivery slip in his jacket pocket and nothing else that gave him a right to be in this room. He stayed. He was still standing there when Sandra came back. She appeared from the hallway with the efficient stride of someone who had just handled something difficult and was already moving on to the next item. She stopped when she saw Daniel hadn't left. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes moved to the boxes on the kitchen floor, then to him, then to Lily, running the calculation of how long he had been standing there and what he had seen. "I can take it from here," she said. It wasn't unfriendly. It was simply the verbal equivalent of a held door. Daniel nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket for the delivery slip, and then the girl spoke. It was quiet, so quiet, he almost missed it beneath the ambient hum of the city coming through the glass. Lily had turned her head toward him just slightly. and her eyes had found his face with something approaching focus. "What did you bring?" Sandra went still. It wasn't the question itself that stopped her. It was what the question meant that Lily had noticed. Someone new had formed a thought about that person had chosen to make contact. Sandra had been in this apartment every day for 18 months. She knew what Lily had been, and she knew what Lily had become. This was the first time in weeks, maybe longer, that the girl had spoken to a stranger without being prompted. A door opened further down the hall. Margaret Hale walked into the living room with the bearing of someone who had trained herself never to enter a room at less than full capacity. She was in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, a woman whose professional armor was so well fitted that it took a moment to notice how exhausted she was underneath it. Her eyes moved to Daniel the way they would move to any unscheduled variable, measuring, categorizing, assigning a probable level of risk. He was a delivery driver, standing in her living room with his jacket still on, and a slip of paper in his hand. Whatever category she put him in, it wasn't one that warranted her full attention. She was about to say something to Sandra when Daniel spoke first. He wasn't looking at Margaret. He was looking at the kitchen counter at the long, ordered row of supplement jars and protein powders and imported wellness products, arranged with the same precision as everything else in the apartment. Greens powders, amino acids, a large, dark-labeled canister of something herbal. He had been looking at them since he'd set the boxes down the way you look at something that pulls at a memory you can't quite place. "How long has she been taking these?" he asked. He kept his voice even conversational, as though the question were entirely reasonable for someone in his position to ask. Any of them in particular? Did any of them start before the symptoms did? Margaret's attention sharpened. "Excuse me." Her voice was the temperature of the room on a winter morning, not raised, just cold, in a way that communicated exactly what she thought of the question and who was asking it. Daniel finally looked at her. "I'm the person who lost his wife because no one asked that question early enough," Shell said. The words landed without drama. He hadn't calibrated them for effect. They were simply what was true, and the plainness of them was what made them impossible to dismiss. Margaret said nothing. In the 3 seconds of quiet that followed, something moved across her face, not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition the way a locked door looks different when you finally see it as a door. She was remembering without wanting to a night 14 months ago, a small voice asking, "Who are you?" Her own shoulders shaking without a sound. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at Sandra and gave a single small nod. Sandra was already moving toward the filing cabinet, where Lily's nutritional records were kept, binders of documentation going back to the beginning. Every meal, every supplement, every dietary adjustment recommended by every specialist who had passed through. She opened the most recent binder to the intake log and set it on the kitchen island. Daniel stepped forward and looked at the page. The log was thorough color-coded, maintained with Sandra's characteristic precision. He scanned the columns, dates, products, dosages moving backward through the months. He was looking for something that started before everything else, did something introduced into the timeline that predated the first symptom. He found it 7 months before the tiredness began. A herbal collagen supplement. Imported. Premium labeled in the way things are labeled when the price point needs to justify itself. The entry note in Sandra's handwriting read, "Per Mrs. Hale, self-sourced, recommended by a certified nutritionist." Daniel walked to the counter and picked up the jar. It was substantial, the kind of packaging that communicates quality through weight alone. He turned it over and read the ingredient panel. Once, then again more slowly. There were 22 listed compounds. Most of them were exactly what they claimed to be. But one listed near the bottom, under its technical name, caught behind something in his memory, like a thread on a nail. He stood there with the jar in his hands and chased the thread backward through 3 years of late-night reading. Backward through dozens of papers he had no formal training to fully evaluate, but had read anyway, because he needed to understand the language of what had happened to Claire. He found it. A study. He couldn't recall the journal name precisely, but he remembered the finding in pediatric patients carrying a rare hepatic enzyme variant, a variant not included in standard diagnostic panels. This compound could accumulate in tissue over months, its effects mimicking autoimmune encephalitis and neurological deterioration with near-perfect accuracy. It had appeared in the literature only recently. It was not on any standard toxicology checklist. He set the jar down carefully. He was not a doctor. He had no right to a conclusion. He was a delivery driver in a $40 million apartment, and the woman across the kitchen island from him controlled more capital than he would earn in 50 lifetimes. And the correct thing to do, the safe thing, the reasonable thing, was to sign his delivery slip and leave. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the slip. He looked at it for a moment, then tore a small strip from the bottom corner, where the paper was blank. He didn't have a pen. Sandra wordlessly held one out to him. He wrote two things: the technical name of the compound, spelled carefully from memory, and the description of the study, enough identifying detail that someone who knew where to look could find it. He set the strip of paper on the kitchen island in front of Margaret. "I'm not making a diagnosis," he said. "I'm saying someone should test for exactly that, specifically in a child with an enzyme variant that the standard panels wouldn't catch." Margaret picked up the strip of paper. She read it. Her face gave nothing away that was her particular discipline, the ability to receive information without broadcasting what it cost her. But her grip on the counter changed just slightly, the way a person holds something solid when the ground has become uncertain. "Why would you know this?" Her voice was different now. The cold was gone. What remained was something more stripped down. Not vulnerability exactly, but the place just before it. Daniel thought about Mason asleep on his chest, about the kitchen light at 2 a.m, and all the pages he had turned trying to find the crack in the wall that had let Claire down. "Because I couldn't save my wife," he said, "and I never stopped reading after that." He signed the delivery slip at the kitchen island. He capped Sandra's pen and handed it back. He picked up his empty hand truck and walked to the elevator, without looking at the hospital bed, or the jar on the counter, or the strip of paper that Margaret was still holding. The elevator doors closed. He stood in the descending car and felt not triumph, not relief, just the particular exhaustion of having done something that may have meant nothing. He didn't know if Margaret would follow up on it. He had no way of knowing. She was a woman who had employed a small army of specialists across 18 months, and he was a man who delivered groceries. The gap between those two things was real, and he was aware of it. He drove back across the bridge in afternoon traffic, the city dissolving behind him into Brooklyn's lower skyline. He picked Mason up from the neighbor's apartment at the end of the block, the boy already talking before the door was fully open. Something about a bird he'd seen on the walk home, the wingspan, whether it was a hawk or a falcon, and what was the actual difference. Daniel listened. He answered. He made pasta for dinner because it was what they had, and because Mason liked it with too much Parmesan, and because keeping the evening ordinary felt important in a way he couldn't have articulated. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel read at night, now cleared of everything but 2 plates and a paper towel folded into an approximate napkin. Mason looked at his father halfway through the meal. The boy had his mother's instinct for atmosphere. He could sense something in the room without being able to name it. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel looked up. "Yeah, bud." Mason considered this, turning a piece of pasta around with his fork. "Did something happen?" "I met a sick kid today," Daniel said. "Younger than you." Mason looked at him with full seriousness. "Is she going to be okay?" The question settled in the air between them. Daniel held it there for a moment, with the weight it deserved. "I don't know," he said. Mason nodded the way he always nodded when the answer was incomplete, not satisfied, but willing to accept what was true. He went back to his pasta. He didn't ask anything more. That was the only conversation Daniel had about what happened that afternoon. He washed the dishes, helped Mason through his reading assignment, and sat at the table after his son went to bed with a journal paper open in front of him that he didn't actually read. Across the river, 38 floors above Central Park, a narrow strip of torn delivery paper lay on a glass-topped table, among the $1,000 things of a woman who had never had to ask anyone for help in her life. It was smaller than a business card. The handwriting was plain and a little cramped, the kind produced by someone who writes to record rather than to impress. 2 items written in pencil because that was what had been available. The city moved outside the windows. Margaret sat in the chair nearest Lily's bed and did not take her eyes off that piece of paper. She sat there for 3 hours. She didn't go to bed. At some point after midnight, Sandra appeared in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water and set it on the table near Margaret's elbow without saying anything. Margaret acknowledged it with the smallest motion of her hand. Sandra went back to her room. The glass sat untouched. Margaret kept her eyes on the strip of paper. She had read it perhaps 40 times by now, not because the words were difficult, but because she was doing what she always did when confronted with information she wasn't sure how to trust. She was testing it, turning it, looking for the angle at which it would reveal itself as wrong. The compound name, the reference to a study, the specificity of it written in pencil on torn paper by a man with no credentials and no apparent motive. All those specialists, $8 million, 18 months, and a delivery driver who had stood in her kitchen for 11 minutes. At 6:15 in the morning, she picked up her phone and called Dr. Warren Elias, the toxicologist from Mayo Clinic, who had led the second specialist team 8 months ago, the one whose panel had concluded, along with everyone else, that the evidence pointed toward autoimmune encephalitis of unknown origin. He answered on the 3rd ring, already awake, already in that clinical register that good doctors maintain even before breakfast. Margaret didn't apologize for the hour. She said, "There's a compound I need you to test for. It wasn't on any panel you ran." She read the name from the strip of paper, spelling it carefully. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking or the quiet of someone pulling up a file. It was the quiet of someone who had just understood something and needed a moment before responding. "We never screened for that," Dr. Elias said. "It wasn't on the standard toxicology request. No one—" He stopped. "No one asked for it. I'm asking now," Margaret said. He had the specialized blood panel requisitioned within the hour. Given the circumstances, given 18 months of documented deterioration, and a patient whose chart he knew by heart, he moved it to priority processing. 72 hours, he told her. Possibly less. It was less. The confirmation came back in 61 hours. Lily had been accumulating the compound for over 2 years, slowly, continuously, at levels that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The mechanism was narrow, and specific children carrying a rare variant in one of the hepatic enzymes responsible for metabolizing this class of botanical compound lacked the ability to process it at normal rates. In those children, it built up in tissue over months. And as it built, it produced a cascade of neurological effects so consistent with autoimmune encephalitis, the tremors, the cognitive loss, the episodic dissociation that even experienced clinicians presented with the clinical picture, without the tox screen, would reach the same wrong conclusion every time. The variant wasn't tested for in standard pediatric panels. The compound wasn't on standard toxicology screens. The supplement that contained it had been certified organic rated premium, endorsed by a wellness professional with 400,000 social media followers, and purchased by a mother who had wanted to give her daughter something good. When Dr. Elias walked Margaret through the results by phone, she sat at her kitchen island and listened without interrupting. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise, both answered. When he finished, she thanked him and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her phone in her hand, and the morning light coming through the windows, the city below bright and indifferent and going about its business. Then she went to Lily's room and opened the door, and stood in the doorway, and looked at her daughter sleeping, and she held the door frame with both hands, and she didn't say anything at all. The jar was removed from the apartment that morning. The detox protocol began the following day. 5 weeks later, Lily asked Sandra where her colored pencils were. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Sandra was updating the medical log at the kitchen island when Lily's voice came from the bedroom, clear, direct, pointed at a specific object in the world. Sandra put down her pen. She walked to the doorway. Lily was sitting up in bed, which she hadn't done without assistance in 4 months, looking at the bedside table with the focused expression of someone who knows a thing, belongs somewhere, and has noticed its absence. Sandra found the pencils in the second drawer of the art cabinet. She brought them without comment, because she understood that the moment didn't need comment. It needed the pencils. 3 weeks after that, at the start of week 8, Sandra found Lily at the small desk in the corner of her room drawing, not copying from a reference, drawing from memory, the careful, precise movements of a child who carried the sky in her head. Star by star, constellation by constellation, the lines connecting them, rendered with the thin, sure strokes of someone who had always known exactly where each one went. By the time she set down the pencil, she had produced a complete map of the autumn sky, accurate to a degree that would have surprised an adult 3 times her age. Sandra stood in the doorway for a long moment before she stepped back into the hall. She didn't call out to Margaret. She simply walked to the study where Margaret was on a call, opened the door quietly, and waited until Margaret looked up. Then Sandra tilted her head toward the hallway just slightly, and Margaret understood. She walked to Lily's room. She stood in the doorway. Lily was still at the desk, her back to the door, adding one final constellation to the upper right corner of the paper, the careful, deliberate movements of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and needed no one to confirm it. The colored pencil scratched lightly against the page. The afternoon light came through the window and caught the drawing, and every star was exactly where it was supposed to be. Margaret's hand came up and covered her mouth. She stood there and did not move, and something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time came loose all at once, not painfully, but completely. This time, Sandra stood beside her in the doorway, and this time, neither of them looked away. Week 12 arrived the way good things sometimes do, not with announcement, but gradually in the accumulation of ordinary moments that eventually amounted to something undeniable. Lily was at the kitchen table with her star chart spread out when she informed Margaret, with the full prosecutorial confidence of a 9-year-old who has prepared her case, that Orion was objectively more beautiful than Ursa Major. She had reasons. She presented them in order. She cited the 3-star alignment of the belt, the mythology, the visibility from both hemispheres, the simple elegance of the shape against a dark sky. Margaret listened. She offered a counter-argument. She was constitutionally incapable of not offering one, but her heart wasn't in it, and Lily knew it, and pressed her advantage accordingly. The debate lasted 20 minutes and ended with Margaret conceding the point. It was the happiest she had lost anything in 18 months. Sandra located Daniel through the delivery company's records. It took one phone call. Margaret met him in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his apartment in Brooklyn, her choice of location, which he seemed to find mildly surprising. She arrived first and was already at a table when he came in still in his work jacket, having come directly from a morning route. He ordered coffee at the counter and carried it over himself. She made the offer plainly, a sum large enough that he would never need to drive a delivery route again. She told him the number without preamble. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you." She offered more. He shook his head again in the same unhurried way, as though the amount weren't the variable. Margaret studied him across the table. She was a woman who had spent 20 years reading people their motivations, their pressure points, the gap between what they said they wanted and what they actually wanted. She could not find the gap in Daniel Cruz. He didn't appear to be performing humility. He appeared to simply not want the money. "Then what do you want?" she asked. He thought about it. Not in the way people think when they're pretending they haven't already considered the question, but in the way someone thinks when they're deciding whether the answer they've been carrying is the right one to say out loud. "There's a medical training program at a teaching hospital in Brooklyn," he said. "They're running a clinical diagnostics curriculum focused on the gaps. Toxicology, clinical nutrition, the categories that standard training moves through too fast. They don't have the funding to expand it, to make it mandatory. To reach the number of residents it needs to reach, to actually change anything." Margaret waited. "Claire went to 3 different doctors over 2 years," Daniel said. "Not one of them had been trained to look where the answer actually was. If even one of them had—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "The program exists. It just needs someone to fund it." Margaret picked up her coffee. She set it down. "Done," she said. Daniel looked at her. "The full program," she said. "Expanded curriculum, mandatory residency integration, however many years of operational funding it takes to embed it permanently. I'll have my team contact the program director this week." She kept her voice even because that was who she was, but her eyes were direct and clear. "It will be named the Claire Cruz Foundation." Something moved across Daniel's face that he didn't try to conceal, not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of being seen in a way you hadn't prepared for. He looked down at his coffee. He nodded once. "There's one more thing," Margaret said. She slid a folded document across the table. "A trust account, in your son's name, for his education wherever he wants to go, whatever he wants to study." Daniel put his hand on the document but didn't open it. "Mason didn't do anything," he said. "He fell asleep on your shoulder while you were reading medical research at 2 a.m, Margaret said. "I'd argue that counts. Daniel woke at 5 the following Tuesday, the same as every morning. He made coffee. He moved quietly through the apartment, packing Mason's bag for school, the reading folder, the permission slip he'd signed the night before, the snack that Mason would eat on the walk and deny eating when asked. He went to the doorway of his son's room and stood there for a moment in the half-dark. Mason was asleep on his stomach, arms flung wide, taking up far more of the bed than a 7-year-old had any reasonable claim to. He slept the way Claire had slept completely, without apparent concern for what the morning might bring. Daniel watched his chest rise and fall. He drove out into the early dark of Brooklyn, the streets still quiet, the bodega on the corner already lit from inside, with that particular fluorescent warmth that meant someone had been up longer than him. The van moved through familiar blocks, past familiar buildings, the routes so known to his body that his hands navigated without instruction. He thought about Lily asking Sandra where her pencils were, the plainness of the question, and the enormous thing it contained. He thought about Margaret standing in that doorway the first time alone in the dark, with her shoulders shaking, and the second time beside someone who stayed. He thought about how a person can move through the same grief twice and have it mean something completely different each time. He thought about Claire, not the way he had thought about her in the first year, when every thought arrived like something breaking. This was different, quieter, warmer, the way you think about someone who has become part of the structure of things rather than an absence in it. He thought about her the way he thought about the reading, as something that had changed his shape, that was in him now in a form that could be used. He hadn't saved Lily because he was extraordinary. He knew that clearly. He had spent 3 years reading alone at a kitchen table while his son slept, and he had done it because grief had broken him open. And the only thing he'd found to put in the cracks was attention. Relentless, unglamorous, middle-of-the-night attention to the question of how the system missed what it missed and what it would take to see it. The answer had been sitting on a kitchen counter in a $40 million apartment, fourth jar from the left, behind its premium label waiting for someone to read the bottom of the ingredient list. He turned onto the next block. The sky above the rooftops to the east had begun to change, the darkness thinning at the edges, that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before the light commits to arriving. Brooklyn in early morning had always felt to him like something gathering itself, like a breath before the sentence. He had driven these streets on the worst mornings of his life and on the ordinary ones, and they had been the same streets either way, unimpressed, continuous, going about their own business. He drove through them now and felt not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had weight and held. There are things that save a child that no degree can certify and no amount of money can purchase. They live instead in the long, unwitnessed hours in the father who lost everything and chose as the only remaining option to keep paying attention, to read one more paper, to ask one more question, to stand in a doorway where he had no right to stand and say the thing that nobody with the proper credentials had thought to say. The van turned east. The light was coming up over the rooftops, now pale and definite, the way morning always comes, in the end, not all at once, but undeniably, until the darkness has nowhere left to be.